The wine glasses clinked together like tiny bells, laughter filling the elegant hall that smelled of roses and polished wood. Flashing cameras captured every proud smile as my younger sister, Emily, was hoisted onto a makeshift throne made of leather and balloons, celebrating her promotion to senior director at Halcyon Corp. I stood at the back of the room, my black dress simple compared to the sequins and designer brands glimmering around me. I clutched my purse tightly, feeling the judgmental stares ripple toward me like waves. They didn't even hide it anymore. "You're a disgrace, Hannah." My mother's voice rang out suddenly, sharp and cruel. Heads turned. Conversations halted. "Go get a life," she said, laughter dripping off her lips like venom. My face burned. I smiled tightly, saying nothing, my heartbeat banging like a drum inside my chest. "Stop clinging to your successful sister," one of Emily's friends added, giggling. "It's embarrassing." Even Emily chuckled awkwardly, looking away as if pretending not to hear. I could feel their words cutting me apart, slicing through the thin armor I'd spent years trying to patch together. But instead of retreating, instead of crumbling, I just laughed. A soft, strange laugh that made a few people glance at me with unease. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the celebration they were throwing for Emily, the champagne they were sipping, the salary she was boasting about, all of it bore my fingerprints. My name. And when the first paycheck came in under the new contract, the truth would be impossible to ignore. The room buzzed again, laughter resuming like nothing had happened, but under the surface, something shifted. I could feel it, like the electricity before a storm. I stayed at the back, watching, listening, memorizing every smug smile, every patronizing glance. My mother mingled effortlessly among the guests, her designer heels clicking with every confident step, while I stood rooted in place, like an invisible statue. "You should find a small job somewhere," Aunt Victoria said, sidling up to me with a glass of champagne she clearly thought I couldn't afford. "Maybe at a local cafe. Something humble. It's important for people like you to stay busy, dear." People like me. I smiled sweetly. "Thanks for the advice." Inside, the words twisted like a knife. I wasn't jobless. I wasn't hopeless. I just chose not to flaunt my life like a trophy. Because success, real success, wasn't about who clapped for you at a party. It was about who still clapped for you when no one else was watching. And I knew how hard I'd worked. The sleepless nights. The deals negotiated at kitchen tables at 3 in the morning. The meetings where I was dismissed because of how young I looked, only to stun the room with ideas they couldn't even begin to understand. I had built something that most of them would never even comprehend. Across the room, Emily posed for another photo, holding a giant check that symbolized her first corporate bonus. She laughed brightly, soaking up the praise. She deserved it. Emily was good at her job, smart and driven. But the reality they didn't know was this. Emily's promotion, her team's recent success, her massive project launch that secured her that director title, had all been made possible because of me. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I believed in her when no one else did, including our own family. The irony stung, almost making me laugh again. They had no idea that 2 years ago, when Emily's department was on the verge of being shut down, she had come to me in tears, terrified of losing her job. That I had sat across from her in a dingy little cafe and listened as she poured out her fear. That I had spent 3 months working behind the scenes, helping her craft a revolutionary new proposal, anonymously providing the research, the reports, the marketing angles she needed, the very ones that eventually saved her department and catapulted her to where she was now. No one clapped for me then. I didn't need them to. I was fine letting Emily shine. I loved her. Even if tonight she laughed along with them, even if she didn't defend me, deep down I knew she didn't mean to hurt me. She just wanted to fit in. My phone buzzed in my purse. I slipped it out, glancing at the screen. An email. Subject: Payroll Authorization Confirmation. I clicked it open and smiled. There it was. My name, in bold, black letters, at the bottom of every paycheck issued to the employees under the new corporate merger, including Emily's. Because when the company she worked for faced a hostile takeover, I was the one who bought 42% of the shares. Quietly, silently, without fanfare. Not to flaunt it, not to punish anyone, but to protect the only person in this room who once cried on my shoulder when she thought her dreams were slipping away. And now, every single payday, the truth would be stamped clearly in black ink. Emily's paycheck authorized by Hannah Whitmore. Me. The sister they pitted. The disgrace who should get a life. The invisible shadow standing at the back of the room. Across the hall, my mother raised her glass, calling everyone to attention. A toast, she said brightly, her lipstick a vibrant, gleaming red. To my brilliant daughter, Emily, the pride of this family. May she soar even higher. Cheers erupted. The crowd raised their glasses, the lights glinting off crystal stems. I raised mine too, an invisible glass, and toasted quietly in my heart. To kindness, to quiet victories, to being underestimated, and to the storms we survive without anyone ever seeing the thunder in our veins. Tonight wasn't about exposing anyone. It wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing the truth in my bones and letting that truth be enough. Because the best kind of success is the one you don't have to shout about. The evening dragged on with speeches, gifts, and endless posing for pictures, but I stayed rooted near the back wall, a silent witness to the celebration. The clatter of forks against plates, the pop of champagne corks, and the soft hum of conversation formed a tapestry of sound around me. But I was somewhere else, somewhere deeper inside myself, where their laughter couldn't reach. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was just awake. Every cruel word tonight, every dismissive glance, every whispered jab behind cupped hands, they weren't knives anymore. They were mirrors. And what they reflected wasn't me, it was them. Their smallness, their fear, their need to measure worth by party invitations and job titles. I watched as Emily's new boss, a short, rotund man with a permanent smirk, handed her an envelope. "First paycheck under your new title," he announced proudly. The room burst into applause again. I saw Emily blush, humbled and proud. She opened the envelope, pulling out the check inside like it was made of gold. She held it up for everyone to see, the amount, the company's emblem. But her hands trembled just slightly as she turned it around, eyes catching something on the bottom right-hand corner. The signature. My signature. Authorized by Hannah Whitmore, Chief Corporate Partner, Halcyon Enterprises. For a moment, Emily just stared. And then she looked up, and our eyes met across the room. A silence fell. It was soft at first, unnoticed by most, just a hiccup in the flow of celebration. But then Emily's hands visibly shook, the check fluttering in her grasp. "Emily? Everything okay?" someone asked. She didn't answer immediately. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for words. And then, in a voice so soft it barely rose above the clinking glasses, she whispered, "Hannah?" My mother's smile faltered. She turned sharply, following Emily's gaze, and found me, standing there. Simple black dress. No fancy jewelry. No smug grin. Just me. Calm. Whole. "What's wrong, sweetie?" my mother asked, concern flickering across her face, concern tainted with annoyance. Emily slowly turned the check around for her to see. I watched as my mother's eyes scanned it, watched as her lips moved silently, reading the name at the bottom once, twice, 3 times. And then, she staggered back a step, like someone had physically struck her. Her wine glass tilted dangerously, spilling a red arc across the cream-colored carpet. Gasps rippled through the room. "What? But she's... Wait, that's..." Whispers rose like a tidal wave, crashing against the fragile walls of their illusions. "She's Hannah Whitmore? The partner? But I thought she was unemployed. I thought she was struggling." The words flew fast and vicious, but this time they weren't aimed at me. They were fired like bullets in every direction, desperate to find a new target. My mother's face crumpled, not with anger, but with something worse, shame. Emily left the center of the room, her heels clicking rapidly across the floor, weaving between stunned guests until she reached me. She stopped barely a foot away, breathing hard, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "You," she said hoarsely. "You're the reason?" I smiled gently, reaching out and brushing a stray hair from her face like I used to when we were kids. "I just wanted you to have a shot," I whispered. "That's all." Emily's lip trembled. She clutched the check to her chest like it was a lifeline. "But why didn't you tell anyone?" she whispered. They said they mocked you." I shrugged lightly. "Because it didn't matter what they said. I know who I am. And I know who you are. That's enough." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she choked. "I should have stood up for you." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't owe me anything, Em. Just live your life. Be happy. That's all the thanks I'll ever need." A sob tore from her throat. She threw her arms around me, clinging tight, her body shaking with gratitude and guilt. Around us, the room buzzed with confusion, curiosity, and silent regret. But none of it mattered anymore. In that moment, in the middle of a celebration meant to crown someone else's success, I reclaimed my own worth, not through revenge, not through public humiliation, but through grace, through kindness, through the quiet, unshakable power of knowing that sometimes winning doesn't look like shouting from the rooftops. It looks like standing tall when everyone expects you to kneel. And that kind of victory, it echoes longer than any applause. For a moment after Emily hugged me, everything blurred, the faces, the clinking glasses, the murmured speculations swirling in the heavy, perfumed air. The celebration had cracked at its foundations, and through the widening gaps, the truth was flooding in. I felt dozens of eyes on my back, but none of it mattered anymore. Not the pity, not the shock, not the guilt slowly blooming on the faces of those who had laughed at me an hour ago. Because for the first time in years, I felt light. I felt free. Emily pulled back, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, laughing shakily through the wreckage of her pride and love. "God, Hannah," she whispered, voice thick. "I feel so stupid." I smiled at her warmly, brushing my thumb gently under her eye, like I used to when she was little, and scraped her knees. "You're not stupid, Em," I said. "You're brave. You're brilliant. And you earned every bit of this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "But you saved me. You saved yourself." I cut her off softly. "I just held the door open when you needed it." Emily nodded fiercely, holding my hand like a lifeline. Behind her, my mother approached, her face pale, her perfect lipstick cracked at the corners. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in my life, my mother looked at me not with superiority or disdain, but uncertainty, like she was seeing me for the very first time. I didn't flinch. I didn't gloat. I didn't fire back cruel words or list all the ways she'd failed me. I simply looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something that broke my heart even more than her humiliation ever could. She had spent so long chasing the appearance of success. She had forgotten what real success even looked like. It wasn't titles. It wasn't parties. It wasn't public praise. It was quiet strength. It was resilience. It was love without conditions. And she had missed it. She had missed me. The realization was like a warm knife sliding between my ribs. But still, I smiled at her, small, sad, and sincere. "Hi, Mom," I said simply. Not with bitterness. Not with triumph. Just with peace. She blinked rapidly, her mouth trembling. It was clear she wanted to say something, apologize maybe, but pride, old and thick as molasses, kept her rooted in place.
And that was okay.
Because I wasn't standing there for an apology. I wasn't standing there for validation. I was standing there because I had already forgiven her. Not for her sake. For mine. Later, after the hall began to empty out, after most of the guests, embarrassed or confused, had made awkward excuses and slipped away, Emily and I sat together on the back patio, overlooking the city lights. The air was cool, and the stars blinked dimly behind a thin veil of clouds. She was quiet for a long time, fiddling with the edge of her check. Did you ever hate me? She asked finally, not meeting my eyes. No, I said without hesitation. Never. She bit her lip. Even when I laughed? When I didn't defend you? I thought about it. Really thought about it. I was hurt, I admitted. But hate?
No.
Because you were surviving too, Em. Just in a different way. She looked up, her eyes raw with gratitude and guilt. I should have been braver, she whispered. I shook my head gently. You're brave now. That's what matters. We sat in silence after that, just breathing, just being. Somewhere deep inside me, a door slammed shut on years of pain, sealing it away like an old, abandoned house no longer worth visiting. I was free, not because they understood me now, not because they finally saw me, but because I no longer needed them to. I had built my own life, my own future, with my own hands, scarred, tired, and stronger than they would ever realize. The next morning, the photos from the party began popping up on social media. At first, they were the usual congratulatory posts. Congrats, Emily. So proud. Biggest success story of the year. But then, whispers started weaving through the comments. People noticed the name on the paycheck Emily had proudly displayed. They Googled it. They connected dots. And just like that, the narrative shifted. It wasn't just Emily, the shining star. It became Emily, backed by silent strength. Emily, the woman who had a powerhouse sister quietly championing her behind the scenes. Articles were written. Not tabloids, real pieces. Features about hidden figures in corporate success stories. About siblings who lift each other quietly, without seeking the spotlight. One journalist even reached out to me for an interview. I declined, politely, because I wasn't interested in becoming a headline. My victory wasn't for the world. It was for me. It was for the little girl who used to sit in the back of classrooms, dreaming of building something no one could take away. It was for the teenager who cried alone after college rejection letters, vowing to never let failure define her. It was for the young woman who had built empires from her living room while everyone else was busy mocking her silence. It was for the woman I had become, strong, soft, and unstoppable. Weeks passed after the party, but the ripple it left behind was bigger than anyone expected. Family gatherings changed. People who once looked through me now looked at me differently, not with pity, not with mockery, but with something closer to respect. Or maybe regret. But I didn't crave their approval anymore. I had outgrown that need, without even realizing it. My mother called once. She stumbled over her words, trying to find the right way to say sorry without ever fully saying it. I listened patiently. When she finished, there was a long silence between us. It's okay, Mom, I said quietly. I'm okay. And I meant it. Because some apologies come too late to heal old wounds, but forgiveness isn't about them. It's about setting yourself free. Emily, on the other hand, became my biggest cheerleader overnight. She visited my office one afternoon, standing awkwardly at the door with 2 coffees and a bouquet of fresh daisies. For the real boss, she grinned, handing them to me. I laughed, taking them from her. We didn't need to say more. The bond between us was stronger now, tempered by fire, forged by truth. One Friday evening, months later, we stood together on the same patio where everything had changed. The city lights blinked below us, soft and alive. Do you ever wish it had happened differently? Emily asked, sipping her coffee. I thought about it, about the pain, the loneliness, the humiliation that had once felt like drowning. No, I said finally, because this way I know the strength wasn't given to me. I built it. She smiled, tears shining in her eyes. You always were the strongest one, she said. I just didn't see it. I squeezed her hand. Now you do. And that's enough. We stood there in the quiet for a long time, no words needed. 2 sisters, different in so many ways, but bound together by something that couldn't be broken: love. Real love. Not the kind that's loud and showy, but the kind that's quiet, fierce, and permanent. The world moved on. The parties faded. The congratulations slowed. But I didn't need an audience anymore. Because sometimes, The most beautiful triumphs aren't the ones the world claps for. They're the ones you carry quietly inside your heart, where no one can take them away. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't standing at the back of the room anymore. I was standing right where I belonged, in the light, in my own story, unshaken, unashamed, and completely, finally, free.
The room fell silent. Every eye locked on the young woman standing in the doorway. "Miss, this is a restricted area," a security guard finally spoke, his tone a mix of suspicion and authority. "I'll only take a minute," she replied, her voice calm but firm. The tension in the air was palpable. She had been standing in the shadow of her family name for too long, and now it was time to face the storm head-on. Just weeks ago, Alyssa Carter had been a name whispered in admiration at high society galas, the pampered heiress to one of the nation's most formidable business empires. But now she was just Alyssa, stripped of luxury, diving headfirst into the murky waters of deception and betrayal. Her once pristine world had cracked wide open the day she found a ledger buried in her late father's desk. A ledger that didn't add up. It wasn't just numbers that raised alarms. It was the pattern of transactions leading to accounts overseas, the shadowy trails of money disappearing into the void. Her father's untimely death had left Alyssa at the helm of Carter Enterprises. A gilded throne had become a battleground overnight, and the whispers in the boardroom had grown louder with every passing day. She knew she couldn't fight what she didn't understand, so she made the boldest decision of her life. She would infiltrate her own company. Gone were the designer suits and meticulous makeup. She transformed into Lila James, a fresh-faced hire with a shaky resume and a desperate smile. And when she stepped into the company as a lowly administrative assistant, the game began. Her new boss was Vincent Reed, a man whose charm barely concealed a sharp edge. "Let's see if you can survive a week," he'd said on her first day, his tone dripping with mockery. Alyssa, now Lila, had smiled back, knowing this was only the beginning. But survival wasn't her goal. Uncovering the truth was. And the deeper she dug, the more sinister the puzzle became. It wasn't just stolen funds. It was the employees who vanished after whistleblowing, the shell corporations siphoning millions, and the cryptic memos exchanged between Vincent and the head of HR, Miranda Cole. Alyssa's undercover work had given her access to secrets that left her breathless with fear and rage. Documents hinted at a hostile takeover orchestrated by board members she'd once trusted, backed by a rival conglomerate poised to gut Carter Enterprises from the inside out. The moment she realized the gravity of her discoveries, she knew she couldn't do it alone. Her unlikely ally came in the form of Clara, a no-nonsense office assistant with a sharp wit and an even sharper instinct for self-preservation. Clara's connections with lower-level employees became Alyssa's window into the soul of the company, a soul her father had built, but that others were now intent on destroying. But it wasn't just whispers in the corridors or data on servers that painted the picture. One fateful evening, while filing documents late into the night, Alyssa overheard Vincent and Miranda arguing in the conference room. "She's poking around where she doesn't belong," Vincent hissed. "And you think firing her will solve the problem? We don't need more loose ends." Miranda shot back. Alyssa froze, her heart pounding as the realization sank in. They were onto her. That night, Clara insisted Alyssa stay at her cramped apartment, far from the surveillance-laden penthouse Alyssa once called home. "This isn't a game anymore," Clara warned. "If they're willing to cross the line with others, they won't think twice about coming after you." The following days were a blur of calculated risks and desperate maneuvers. Alyssa and Clara worked tirelessly to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy. They hacked into secured servers, intercepted incriminating emails, and even planted a recording device in Vincent's office. But the climax came during a quarterly board meeting, where Alyssa, disguised as Lila, was tasked with organizing materials. Hidden in plain sight, she set up a live stream, broadcasting the meeting's proceedings to a secure location where Clara was monitoring. What unfolded in that room was worse than Alyssa had imagined. The board wasn't just complicit. They were architects of the scheme. Plans for asset stripping, layoffs, and the eventual collapse of Carter Enterprises were laid bare. And leading the charge? Vincent and Miranda, with their smug assurances that no one would stop them. As Alyssa listened, the fire in her gut ignited into a blaze. She wouldn't let her father's legacy crumble under their greed. The next morning, Alyssa confronted them, not as Lila, but as herself. "I know what you've been doing," she declared, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Vincent's face paled. "You're making a mistake," he growled. "No, Vincent. The mistake was thinking you could get away with it." With the evidence Alyssa and Clara had collected, the authorities were summoned, and arrests were made. But the fight wasn't over. Alyssa faced months of rebuilding trust within her company and navigating the fallout of exposing some of its most powerful players. Yet, through it all, she remained undeterred. The heiress who once lived in the shadow of privilege had become a warrior in her own right, determined to reclaim her father's dream and build a legacy worth fighting for. And as she stood at the helm of Carter Enterprises, Alyssa knew one thing for certain. The battle for justice was just beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The fallout was swift and unrelenting. News of the scandal rocked the corporate world, sending shockwaves through media outlets and financial institutions alike. Alyssa's decision to blow the whistle on her own company was both lauded and criticized, but there was no denying one fact. She had shattered the facade of perfection that Carter Enterprises had maintained for decades. The following weeks were a grueling test of endurance. Lawyers, auditors, and investigators descended upon the company, combing through years of financial records and contracts. The scale of corruption uncovered was staggering. Employees who had been coerced into silence came forward, their stories painting a grim picture of exploitation and greed. Alyssa didn't flinch under the pressure. Every day, she stood before rooms filled with skeptical investors and frightened employees, vowing to restore the company's integrity. "We've been broken," she admitted in one particularly intense meeting. "But broken doesn't mean beyond repair. Together, we'll rebuild. Stronger, smarter, and more honest." Her words carried weight, but they weren't enough to silence all the doubters. Among them were those who questioned her motives, wondering if the heiress was merely seeking to salvage her own image. Alyssa knew that actions would speak louder than any speech she could give. With Clara's help, she launched an internal task force to root out any remaining corruption. She also enlisted a third-party firm to oversee compliance and ensure transparency. Every decision was meticulously documented and shared with stakeholders, an act of good faith to restore trust. But while the company's wounds were slowly mending, Alyssa's personal life was unraveling. One late evening, as she pored over documents in her father's old study, a manila envelope was slipped under the door. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat as she picked it up, her name scrawled in sharp handwriting across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a cryptic message. "What you've seen is only the beginning. If you value your life, stop digging." Her breath hitched. This wasn't the first threat she'd received, but this one felt different. The message wasn't just a warning. It was a challenge. "Who sent it?" Clara asked when Alyssa showed her the note. "Someone who knows I won't back down," Alyssa replied. Clara frowned. "This is serious. We need protection." Alyssa nodded. She'd already increased security around her home and office, but the note confirmed her worst fears. The corruption she had exposed was only the tip of the iceberg. Somewhere out there were bigger players, people with resources and influence who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her if she got too close to the truth. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of the whistleblowers, a mid-level accountant named Nate, approached Alyssa with information he had been too afraid to share before. "I worked on the offshore accounts," he confessed, his hands trembling. But it wasn't just Carter Enterprises. There were other companies involved, big ones. "They're connected like a network." Alyssa leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "A network?" Nate nodded. "They call it the Syndicate. It's a group of powerful corporations and individuals who control everything from markets to legislation. Your father stumbled onto it years ago. That's why he trailed off, but Alyssa understood. Her father's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was an execution. Fueled by this revelation, Alyssa threw herself deeper into the investigation. She and Clara worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of information Nate had provided. The syndicate wasn't just targeting Carter Enterprises. It was manipulating entire industries for profit. But every step forward came with a price. Alyssa's nights were plagued with paranoia, her every move shadowed by unseen eyes. Her car was tampered with, forcing her to rely on hired drivers. A package delivered to her office turned out to contain a broken clock. Its hands stopped at 3:15, the exact time her father's car had gone off the road. "They're trying to scare you," Clara said one night as they reviewed their findings in a secured office. "They want you to give up." "They're wasting their time," Alyssa replied, her jaw set with determination. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've hurt, and everyone they will hurt if we don't stop them." The final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely ally, an ex-syndicate member who had grown disillusioned with their methods. Known only as Elias, he reached out through encrypted messages, offering to expose the syndicate's leadership in exchange for protection. Meeting Elias was a gamble, but Alyssa knew it was one she had to take. In a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of the city, she finally came face to face with the man who could bring it all down. "They'll kill me for this," Elias said, his voice trembling. "Then why are you doing it?" Alyssa asked. "Because your father believed in something bigger than himself," Elias replied. "He gave his life trying to stop them. If you have even a fraction of his courage, maybe, just maybe, you can finish what he started." Elias handed over a flash drive containing files that mapped out the syndicate's operations. Names, dates, transactions, it was all there. But as Alyssa and Clara pored over the data, they realized the true scale of the challenge ahead. The syndicate wasn't just powerful. It was embedded in the fabric of society. Taking it down would require not just evidence, but allies, strategy, and an unyielding will. "This is it," Alyssa said, staring at the screen. "This is the fight my father died for. And it's the fight we're going to win," Clara replied, her voice resolute. The syndicate had declared war, but Alyssa wasn't just defending her legacy anymore. She was fighting for justice, for truth, and for the countless lives that had been trampled under the weight of greed and corruption. The battle was far from over, but Alyssa Carter was ready to face it head-on. The revelation of the syndicate's reach was staggering. Alyssa and Clara knew they were facing an opponent with unlimited resources, shadowy connections, and a willingness to destroy anyone who stood in their way. But they also had something the syndicate didn't expect: the courage to fight back. With Elias's files in hand, Alyssa began assembling a team of allies she could trust. First was Clara, whose loyalty and ingenuity had been unshakable from the start. Then came Nate, the accountant who risked everything to come forward. Elias, though reluctant, agreed to stay on as an advisor, offering insights into the syndicate's inner workings. But Alyssa needed more. To dismantle the syndicate, she needed people with power, influence, and a platform to expose the truth. She turned to Emery Tate, a veteran journalist known for taking down corporate giants. "You're playing with fire," Emery said after Alyssa laid out her case in a private meeting. "I know," Alyssa replied, "but this fire is already burning everything my father built. I can't stand by and let it spread." Emery studied her for a long moment before nodding. "If you're willing to risk it all, so am I. But be prepared, this won't end cleanly." The plan was ambitious and dangerous. Expose the syndicate piece by piece, forcing its members into the light where they were most vulnerable. It would require timing, precision, and an iron will. The first target was Vincent Reed. Using the files Elias provided, Clara uncovered a series of meetings Vincent had with high-ranking syndicate members. One meeting, set to take place at a luxury hotel, presented the perfect opportunity to strike. Alyssa and Clara, disguised as hotel staff, infiltrated the venue with hidden cameras. From a service corridor, they watched as Vincent sat down with two men Elias identified as key syndicate operatives. "This merger will go through, no matter what obstacles she throws at us," Vincent said, his tone smug. "By the time Carter Enterprises collapses, she'll be nothing more than a cautionary tale." Alyssa's blood boiled, but Clara placed a steadying hand on her arm. "We'll take him down," she whispered. They captured everything on tape: the plans, the bribes, and Vincent's damning admission of sabotaging Carter Enterprises. The footage was delivered anonymously to Emery, who wasted no time releasing an explosive expose. The fallout was immediate. Vincent was arrested, and the syndicate's influence began to crack. But the victory came at a cost. The syndicate retaliated with brutal efficiency. Alyssa's office was ransacked, her personal bank accounts frozen. Clara narrowly escaped a car accident that was no accident at all. And Elias, the syndicate's defector, went dark, leaving Alyssa to wonder if he had been silenced or turned against her. "They're trying to break us," Alyssa said one night, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "They're afraid of us," Clara countered. "That's why they're fighting so hard. We've shaken them, Alyssa. We just have to hold on." But holding on became harder with each passing day. The syndicate's connections reached into law enforcement, politics, and the media, spinning narratives that painted Alyssa as a desperate heiress seeking revenge for her father's death. Public support wavered, but Alyssa refused to back down. She doubled down on her efforts, rallying employees at Carter Enterprises and launching initiatives to rebuild the company's reputation. "This isn't just about taking them down," she told her team. "It's about proving that we can be better, that we will be better." The next breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Clara managed to decrypt a hidden file in Elias's data, a list of syndicate meeting locations and encrypted communications. The list included a high-level summit scheduled to take place in 2 weeks. "This is our chance," Alyssa said, her eyes alight with determination. "To do what?" Nate asked. "To bring them all down," she replied. The summit was to be held at a private estate under heavy security. Alyssa and her team devised a bold plan: infiltrate the event, plant surveillance equipment, and gather undeniable evidence of the syndicate's operations. The night of the summit was one of tension and danger. Alyssa, dressed as a server, moved through the estate with calculated precision, placing tiny cameras and microphones in key locations. Clara monitored everything from a nearby van, guiding Alyssa through the labyrinthine corridors. But the syndicate was nothing if not vigilant. Alyssa's heart nearly stopped when a guard confronted her near the conference room. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "Refilling drinks," she said, holding up a tray with a calmness she didn't feel. The guard's eyes narrowed, but he waved her off. Alyssa exhaled slowly, her nerves taut as a wire. Inside the conference room, the syndicate's leaders spoke freely, unaware they were being recorded. They discussed plans to manipulate markets, silence whistleblowers, and orchestrate political deals. As Alyssa listened, one name made her blood run cold: Elias. "He's been compromised," one man said. "We'll deal with him after the summit." Alyssa's stomach churned. She had to warn him, but first she needed to finish the mission. Hours later, with the evidence secured, Alyssa slipped out of the estate and rejoined Clara. "We got it," she said, collapsing into the van. But the victory was bittersweet. Elias's life hung in the balance, and the syndicate would retaliate with everything they had. The following morning, Emery released the recordings. The expose sent shockwaves through the nation, sparking investigations and arrests. But the syndicate's core remained elusive, their influence still strong. As Alyssa stood before the cameras, addressing the media, she knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope. The syndicate was no longer untouchable, and she was just getting started. The syndicate's retaliation came faster than Alyssa had anticipated. The day after the recordings were released, her personal security team intercepted a package delivered to her office. Inside was a simple card with the words, "You're in over your head. Stop or we'll stop you." Clara's face darkened when she saw it. "They're getting desperate." "They should be," Alyssa replied, her voice like steel. "The cracks are starting to show." But even as she said it, she knew the fight was far from over. The syndicate's power ran deeper than anything she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just about corporate greed anymore. It was about control over the very systems that govern society. The evidence from the summit had sparked nationwide outrage. Politicians and corporate leaders implicated in the recordings were scrambling to cover their tracks. Public opinion swung sharply in Alyssa's favor, with calls for sweeping reform growing louder by the day. But the syndicate wasn't going down without a fight. Elias's disappearance weighed heavily on Alyssa. He had been her most valuable insider, and without him, her team was left with unanswered questions about the syndicate structure and leadership. He knew the risks, Clara said one evening as they reviewed the fallout from the summit exposé. But we need to focus on what we do have. And what we have, Nate added, joining the conversation, is a list of names tied to off-the-books transactions. If we follow the money, we might find their next move. Alyssa nodded, her mind racing. The syndicate's strength was its secrecy, but every shadow had a source of light. They just had to find it. Over the next week, Alyssa and her team worked tirelessly to track the syndicate's financial operations. Clara's tech skills were invaluable, allowing them to access encrypted communications and hidden accounts. One name kept surfacing: Alexander Voss. Voss was a billionaire with a reputation for ruthless business tactics. Publicly, he owned a chain of luxury resorts, but the data suggested he was the syndicate's financial mastermind, controlling their vast network of shell companies and offshore accounts. If we take him down, Alyssa said, we cut off their funding. But getting to Voss wouldn't be easy. He was a ghost, moving between private estates and heavily guarded events. Alyssa knew they needed a way in, and the opportunity came in the form of an exclusive charity gala Voss was hosting in Monaco. The gala was a who's who of the global elite, exactly the kind of crowd where the syndicate felt untouchable. Alyssa and Clara hatched a plan to infiltrate the event, posing as wealthy philanthropists with a supposed interest in Voss's resorts. You're sure about this? Clara asked as they boarded the flight to Monaco. Alyssa nodded. If we want to expose them, we have to play their game. The opulence of the gala was staggering. Crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, and a sea of designer gowns. Alyssa and Clara blended seamlessly, their carefully curated personas drawing just the right amount of attention. It didn't take long for Voss to notice Alyssa. You must be new to these circles, he said, approaching her with a glass of wine in hand. Not as new as I look, Alyssa replied smoothly, flashing a practiced smile. Voss chuckled, his sharp eyes assessing her. And what brings you here? Business, she said, leaning in slightly. I've heard you're the man to talk to when it comes to ambitious investments. Voss smirked, clearly intrigued. Ambition, I like that. Let's talk. Alyssa's heart pounded as she followed him to a private lounge. Clara, listening through an earpiece, whispered updates as she navigated the gala, planting surveillance devices and intercepting communications. Voss was charming, but Alyssa could sense the menace beneath his polished exterior. He spoke in vague terms about opportunities and partnerships, but she pushed just enough to keep him interested without raising suspicion. When he finally excused himself, Alyssa returned to Clara, who was waiting in the kitchen. Did we get anything? Alyssa asked, pulling off her heels. Clara grinned. Oh, we got plenty. Back in their hotel room, the team reviewed the data Clara had collected. Among the intercepted communications was a coded message outlining a meeting between Voss and several high-ranking syndicate members. It's happening in 3 days, Clara said, pointing to the details. A private yacht in international waters. Alyssa felt a surge of determination. This was their chance to catch the syndicate's leadership in one place, with nowhere to hide. But it was also a risk unlike any they'd taken before. The syndicate would be armed, prepared for betrayal, and ruthless in their response to any threat. We'll need a plan, Alyssa said. And this time, no room for error. 3 days later, Alyssa and her team found themselves aboard a borrowed speedboat, racing toward the syndicate's yacht under the cover of darkness. Clara had hacked the yacht's security system, creating a window for them to board unnoticed. Once on board, the plan was simple. Plant surveillance devices, gather evidence, and get out before anyone noticed. But nothing about the syndicate was ever simple. The yacht was a fortress, its corridors patrolled by armed guards. Alyssa's heart pounded as she moved through the shadows, her every step calculated and silent. In the main conference room, she caught a glimpse of Voss and the syndicate's leadership gathered around a table, discussing their next moves. Clara's voice crackled in her earpiece. We're live. Everything's being recorded. But just as Alyssa turned to leave, a hand grabbed her arm. Going somewhere? She spun around to face one of the guards, his expression cold and unforgiving. Clara, Alyssa whispered, "We've been compromised." The guard's grip tightened, but before he could raise the alarm, Clara's voice came through again. "Hold on." A second later, the yacht's lights flickered, then went out completely. In the chaos, Alyssa broke free and sprinted toward the speedboat. Clara was waiting for her, the engine already roaring. "Did you get it?" she shouted as Alyssa jumped aboard. "I got it," Alyssa replied, clutching the device containing the syndicate's most sensitive plans. As they sped away, gunshots rang out behind them, but the yacht quickly faded into the night. Back on land, Alyssa and her team reviewed the data. It was everything they needed: names, locations, and detailed records of the syndicate's operations. "This is it," Clara said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and triumph. Alyssa nodded, her expression hard. "Let's end this." The next morning, they delivered the evidence to international authorities and trusted media outlets. The syndicate's empire began to crumble as arrests were made worldwide. For Alyssa, it wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. The fight had cost her everything, but she had kept her father's legacy alive. And as she stood on the steps of Carter Enterprises, addressing a crowd of employees and reporters, she knew this was only the beginning. Because while the syndicate had been exposed, Alyssa Carter had become something even they couldn't destroy, a symbol of defiance, justice, and unyielding strength. The sound of frantic knocks on his creaky front door shattered the silence of the night. Dylan, a struggling young man barely making ends meet, froze mid-step in his dimly lit living room. It was nearing midnight, and visitors weren't exactly common in his rundown neighborhood. Cautiously, he approached the door, his heart thudding in his chest. Pulling it open, he found a woman, soaked to the bone from the storm raging outside, clutching a shivering little boy in her arms. Her eyes, wide with fear and desperation, locked onto his. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "We need help." Dylan hesitated. The woman looked exhausted, her thin coat offering little protection against the elements. The boy clung to her, his tiny face pale and tear-streaked. Dylan's instinct screamed to close the door. Strangers meant trouble, and he had enough problems of his own. But something in her trembling plea stopped him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. As they stumbled into the warmth of his modest home, the woman's guarded gratitude didn't go unnoticed. She introduced herself as Erin and her son as Jamie. She avoided his questions about why they were out in such terrible weather, brushing off his concerns with vague answers about needing to escape a bad situation. Dylan didn't press further, though curiosity gnawed at him. Instead, he offered them dry clothes and a place to sleep, deciding that whatever storm had driven them to his doorstep, it wasn't his business. But the next morning, things began to unravel. When Dylan woke up, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled his tiny apartment. Rubbing his eyes, he shuffled into the kitchen to find Erin at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. Jamie sat at the table, giggling as he tried to spoon-feed himself with little success. "Good morning," Erin said, her voice warm but still tinged with hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," Dylan mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. He wasn't used to anyone cooking in his space, let alone strangers. "It's the least I could do," Erin replied, glancing over her shoulder. "Thank you again for letting us stay. I didn't know where else to go." There it was again, the cryptic, incomplete explanation. Dylan didn't press, but as the day went on, he noticed little things that didn't add up. Erin's nervous glances out the window, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the bruises faintly visible on her wrist when her sleeve slipped up. It wasn't until that evening, after Jamie had fallen asleep on the couch, that Dylan found the courage to ask. "Erin, what's really going on?" he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't just show up at a stranger's door in the middle of the night without a reason." Erin hesitated, her hands tightening around the mug she was holding. "It's complicated," she began, her voice trembling. But the short version? I was married to someone dangerous, controlling. Jamie and we had to get out before it was too late. Dylan's chest tightened. He'd seen stories like this on the news, but never imagined he'd be face to face with someone living it. Does he know where you are? Dylan asked. No, Erin said quickly, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes betrayed her. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Dylan found himself growing attached to Jamie, who followed him around like a shadow, and to Erin, whose quiet strength amazed him. But the peace was short-lived. One afternoon, as Dylan walked home from his part-time job, he spotted a black SUV parked down the street. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in his neighborhood, too sleek, too polished. A man in a suit leaned against it, scanning the area like a predator stalking its prey. Dylan's stomach churned. Something about the man set off alarm bells. When he got home, Erin was pacing the living room, her face pale. What's wrong? Dylan asked, already fearing the answer. He's here, she whispered. From that moment, the tension became unbearable. Dylan fortified his apartment as best as he could, double-locking doors, keeping curtains drawn, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The man in the SUV wasn't just looking for Erin. He was hunting her. One night, the sound of glass shattering jolted Dylan awake. He sprang out of bed and raced to the living room, where Erin stood frozen, clutching Jamie tightly. A masked intruder loomed in the broken window, his eyes cold and calculating. Hand them over, and no one gets hurt, the man growled. Get out, Dylan shouted, grabbing a baseball bat he kept by the door. The man smirked, clearly unimpressed. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, kid. But Dylan didn't back down. The adrenaline coursing through him made him fearless, even as the intruder lunged at him. The fight was chaotic. Furniture toppled, and the apartment was thrown into disarray. But Dylan managed to land a solid hit, driving the man back out the window. As sirens wailed in the distance, the intruder disappeared into the night. The police arrived shortly after, but their involvement brought more questions than answers. Erin's full story came to light. Her ex-husband was a wealthy, influential man with a dark side he kept well hidden. She'd left him after discovering the extent of his crimes, taking Jamie to protect him. But her ex wasn't just after her out of spite. She held evidence that could ruin him. Dylan couldn't believe the depth of the danger he'd unwittingly stepped into. You can leave, Erin said the next day, her voice heavy with guilt. You've already done more than enough. I can't ask you to risk your life for us. But Dylan shook his head. You're not going anywhere. Not until this is over. With nowhere else to turn, they devised a plan to take Erin's evidence to the authorities. But as they set their plan into motion, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The plan seemed straightforward. Get Erin's evidence to someone in law enforcement who wasn't under her ex-husband's thumb. But nothing about their situation was simple. Dylan didn't fully trust the police. He'd seen enough corruption in his life to know better, but Erin had a contact she believed in. A detective named Morales who had once helped a close friend of hers escape a similar nightmare. Late that night, as Jamie slept curled up on the couch, Erin pulled out a small, battered USB drive from her purse. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bank records, emails, surveillance footage. All of it. Dylan stared at the drive. It was so small, yet it held enough weight to topple a man as powerful as her ex-husband. How do we know Morales can handle this? Dylan asked. He's the only one I trust, Erin replied, but even she sounded unsure. The next morning, Dylan borrowed a friend's old beater car, its engine sputtering like it might give out any second. He didn't want to risk being tracked, so they ditched their phones and stuck to back roads. The tension in the car was palpable, Erin constantly glancing over her shoulder, while Jamie clutched his toy dinosaur tightly, sensing the unease in the air. As they neared the city, Dylan spotted a black SUV in the rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. We've got company, he said, his voice tight. Erin twisted in her seat, her face paling as she recognized the vehicle. It's him. Dylan's grip on the wheel tightened. Hold on. He slammed his foot on the gas, the old car groaning in protest. The SUV roared behind them, its driver clearly unbothered by the traffic laws Dylan was desperately trying to navigate. The chase was a blur of screeching tires and near misses. Dylan swerved onto a side street, narrowly avoiding a collision, but the SUV was relentless. Jamie started crying, and Erin did her best to calm him, though her own fear was palpable. "Take the next right," Erin shouted, spotting an alleyway ahead. Dylan obeyed, the car skidding as he turned. The alley was narrow, littered with trash, but it was their only chance. The SUV couldn't follow them here. For a moment, it seemed like they'd lost him. The street ahead opened up, and Dylan drove until they reached a small parking garage. He pulled into a shadowy corner and killed the engine, the silence almost deafening. "Is everyone okay?" Dylan asked, his voice shaky. Jamie sniffled but nodded, while Erin just squeezed Dylan's arm. They made it to Morales' safe house an hour later. The detective was an imposing man with a no-nonsense demeanor, but his eyes softened when he saw Erin and Jamie. "You did the right thing coming to me," he said, taking the USB drive from Erin. "But this isn't over. If your ex knows you have this, he'll stop at nothing to get it back." "We figured that out," Dylan muttered, his mind replaying the chase. Morales promised to keep them safe while he worked to expose Erin's ex. For a few days, they stayed holed up in the safe house, tension thick in the air. But the calm didn't last. One night, Morales' phone buzzed. He read the message and cursed under his breath. "They found us." The safe house was supposed to be impenetrable, but Erin's ex had resources Dylan couldn't even fathom. Within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was swarming with black SUVs. "We need to move," Morales barked, grabbing his gun. Dylan helped Erin and Jamie out the back, adrenaline surging as he heard footsteps closing in. They made it to a second car Morales had stashed nearby, and Dylan took the wheel again. The chase was even more chaotic this time, bullets pinging off the car as they tore through the city. Morales returned fire from the passenger seat, his aim sharp, but the SUVs kept coming. "Where are we going?" Dylan shouted over the chaos. "To the station," Morales replied. "If we can get this drive into the system, his people won't be able to cover it up." They barely made it. The car skidded to a halt in front of the police station, smoke billowing from the engine. Morales ushered them inside, shouting orders to his colleagues. For hours, Erin and Dylan sat in a small office while Morales worked. The station buzzed with activity, officers scrambling to handle the fallout of Erin's revelations. Finally, Morales returned, his face grim but triumphant. "We've got him," he said. "The evidence is secure, and a warrant is out for his arrest." Erin burst into tears, the weight of years of fear and uncertainty finally lifting. In the weeks that followed, Erin's ex was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes. Dylan helped Erin and Jamie start a new life, far away from the city where their nightmare had begun. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in years they felt safe. And for Dylan, who had spent so much of his life feeling lost and powerless, he found something he never expected: a purpose. The next few weeks after Erin's ex-husband's arrest were supposed to be a reprieve, but life didn't ease up as much as Dylan had hoped. Erin and Jamie stayed at a motel on the edge of town while Morales and the authorities tried to wrap up the loose ends of the case. Dylan stayed nearby, unable to abandon the people who had turned his life upside down, and, in a strange way, given it meaning. But Dylan's newfound sense of purpose wasn't without its challenges. His landlord wasn't thrilled about the damage to his apartment from the earlier break-in, and the repairs would cost more than Dylan could afford. Morales had promised compensation once the case resolved, but for now, Dylan had to pick up more shifts at his low-paying maintenance job just to stay afloat. One evening, after a grueling 12-hour day, Dylan stopped by the motel to check on Erin and Jamie. As he approached the room, he could hear Jamie's laughter from inside. For a moment, it made him smile. He hadn't heard the boy laugh like that in weeks. When Erin opened the door, she looked less tense than usual, though the dark circles under her eyes hadn't disappeared. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "We were just finishing dinner." Dylan entered the small room, his heart warming at the sight of Jamie playing with a set of toy cars on the floor. "How was work?" Erin asked as she handed Dylan a cup of coffee. Long, he replied, sinking into the chair by the window. But I'm managing. Erin sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but Dylan couldn't ignore the lingering tension in Erin's posture. They're not giving you trouble here, are they? He asked. No, Erin said quickly, though her eyes flicked toward the window. But I can't help feeling like it's not over, like he's still out there, waiting for the right moment. Dylan's jaw tightened. He's in custody. Morales said they're building an airtight case against him. I know, Erin said, her voice barely above a whisper. But men like him, they always have people. Loyal ones. Ones who'll do anything for the right price. The next day, Dylan's suspicions that Erin's fears weren't unfounded were confirmed. As he left work, he noticed a man lingering near his building. A man who didn't fit in with the usual crowd of weary tenants and tired workers. The stranger was dressed too neatly, his gaze sharp as he pretended to check his phone. Dylan ducked around the corner and watched. The man seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. His heart pounded as he realized the man wasn't there by coincidence. Dylan quickly left through a back exit, taking a longer route to the motel. When he arrived, he found Erin pacing the room, her phone in hand. She looked up as he entered, her face pale. What's wrong? Dylan asked, setting his bag down. Morales called, Erin said, her voice trembling. The evidence we gave him, it's being challenged in court. He thinks someone's trying to get the case thrown out. Dylan felt his stomach sink. What does that mean? It means he could walk, Erin said, her eyes filling with tears. And if that happens, Dylan didn't need her to finish the sentence. That night, Dylan stayed at the motel with Erin and Jamie, too uneasy to leave them alone. As they tried to sleep, Dylan lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the building. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 3 a.m., his instincts proved correct. A faint scraping noise came from the door. Dylan bolted upright, his heart racing. Stay with Jamie, he whispered to Erin as he grabbed the closest thing to a weapon. A lamp from the nightstand. The door handle jiggled, and then the lock clicked. Dylan held his breath, his grip tightening on the lamp. The door creaked open, and a figure slipped inside, their movements deliberate and silent. Without thinking, Dylan swung the lamp, catching the intruder off guard. The man grunted in pain but quickly recovered, lunging at Dylan with a knife. They grappled in the dim light, the fight chaotic and brutal. Erin screamed, waking Jamie, who started crying. The noise seemed to throw the intruder off, giving Dylan the opening he needed to land a solid punch. The man stumbled back, and Dylan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jamie and Erin and bolted out the door, not stopping until they reached the motel office. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the intruder was gone. The attack only confirmed what Dylan and Erin had feared. Her ex-husband's reach extended far beyond a jail cell. Morales arranged for them to be moved to a safe house in another state. But the journey there was anything but smooth. The constant threat of being followed or ambushed kept them on edge, and every stranger they passed felt like a potential enemy. Dylan could see the toll it was taking on Erin. Her once strong resolve was beginning to crack, and Jamie's usual cheerfulness was replaced by a quiet, wary demeanor. But Dylan refused to give up. He promised himself he would see them through this no matter what it took. The drive to the new safe house was grueling. Dylan, Erin, and Jamie crammed into another borrowed car. This one an aging sedan with a shaky steering wheel and an air conditioner that wheezed more than it cooled. Morales had arranged for a series of checkpoints where trusted contacts would guide them, but each stop was fraught with unease. As Dylan drove, the miles stretching endlessly ahead, Jamie dozed off in the back seat. Erin sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. You should rest, Dylan said gently. I can't, Erin whispered, her voice tight. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, or his men. They're always there, waiting to take Jamie. Dylan gripped the wheel tighter. They won't. Not while I'm here. Erin turned to him, her expression softening. Why are you doing this, Dylan? You could have walked away, should have walked away. But you didn't. Why? Dylan hesitated. He didn't have a neat answer. I know what it's like to feel powerless, he said finally. To feel like the whole world's against you. I don't want Jamie to grow up feeling that way. Erin reached out and placed her hand over his. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Their next checkpoint was a secluded diner off a deserted highway. The contact, a woman named Susan, was waiting for them in a corner booth, her hair tucked under a baseball cap. She gave them a quick nod as they slid into the seats across from her. I've got your next steps mapped out, Susan said, sliding a folded map across the table. But you need to move fast. There's chatter that they're closing in. Erin paled. How close? Close enough, Susan said grimly. I suggest you don't stick around here long. As they left the diner, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The parking lot was empty except for a rusty truck and a lone sedan. But something felt off. Get in the car, he said, his voice low and urgent. What is it? Erin asked, her eyes darting around. Just get in, Dylan insisted. The moment they were back in the car, Dylan started the engine and pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the lone sedan rumbled to life, its headlights snapping on. They're following us, Dylan muttered. The pursuit quickly escalated. Dylan pushed the old sedan to its limits, the engine roaring as he sped down the empty highway. The pursuing car kept pace, its driver clearly skilled. Jamie, keep your head down, Dylan shouted as the first bullet shattered the back window. Erin screamed, pulling Jamie into her arms and shielding him with her body. Dylan swerved, narrowly avoiding another volley of gunfire. Up ahead, the highway forked, one path leading to a wooded area. Without hesitation, Dylan veered onto the forest road, hoping the rough terrain would slow their pursuers. The car jolted violently as it hit the uneven dirt path, but the pursuing vehicle stayed close, its headlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. Dylan spotted a narrow trail veering off to the left and took it, the trees closing in around them like a tunnel. Finally, the sound of the pursuing car faded, swallowed by the dense forest. Dylan brought the car to a screeching halt and killed the engine, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Is everyone okay? He asked, turning to look at Erin and Jamie. We're fine, Erin said, though her voice shook. Jamie nodded, his eyes wide with fear but otherwise unharmed. We need to keep moving, Erin said. They'll be back. The safe house was less of a house and more of a dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. Morales had warned them it wasn't much, but it was secure. Dylan wasn't convinced. It looked like a stiff breeze could knock it over, but it would have to do. Inside, Dylan barricaded the doors and windows as best as he could while Erin tried to comfort Jamie. The tension was suffocating, every creak of the old cabin setting them on edge. Hours turned into days, the isolation gnawing at their nerves. Morales occasionally checked in through a secure line, assuring them that progress was being made, but it wasn't enough to dispel their fear. And then, one night, the inevitable happened. Dylan was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. He grabbed the hunting rifle Morales had left with them and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Shadows shifted between the trees, and then a flashlight beam swept across the cabin. They're here, Dylan whispered, his voice shaking. Erin clutched Jamie tightly, her eyes wide with terror. Stay in the bedroom, Dylan instructed. Don't come out until I say it's safe. Erin nodded, disappearing into the back room with Jamie. Dylan positioned himself by the front door, the rifle trembling in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, and then the door rattled as someone tried to force it open. Get out of here, Dylan shouted, his voice cracking. The response was a gunshot, the bullet splintering the wooden door. Dylan fired back, the recoil nearly knocking him off his feet. The attackers scattered, shouting orders to each other. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Dylan moved from window to window, firing at shadows and dodging bullets that shattered the cabin's fragile walls. The attackers were relentless, but Dylan's desperation gave him an edge. Finally, a distant shout rang out, Morales's voice. Drop your weapons. Hands in the air. The attackers hesitated, and then the sound of police sirens filled the air. When the dust settled, Morales explained that they had intercepted communications about the attack and arrived just in time. Aaron's ex-husband's network was dismantled, and he was now facing additional charges for orchestrating the assault. For the first time in weeks, Dylan, Aaron, and Jamie could breathe freely. In the months that followed, Aaron and Jamie started rebuilding their lives, this time without the shadow of fear hanging over them. Dylan stayed in touch, helping them settle into a new home and even finding a better job for himself in the process. Aaron never stopped thanking him, but Dylan always brushed it off. "I just did what anyone would do," he said. But Aaron knew better. Not everyone would have risked everything for strangers. Dylan had proven that even in the darkest of times, kindness and courage could change lives, and maybe even save them.